This presentation is going to chronicle our research with the Supreme Court cases in defending the Scottsboro boys after what we've learned in class. So, the first Supreme Court cases that dealt with racial bias that applied to the Scottsboro boys were actually cases with them. So, in the U.S., the Supreme Court is the ultimate judicial body, and they really set precedents for later cases. So, there were several landmark cases centered around racial bias involved with the Scottsboro boys. So, the first one was in 1932 with Ozzie Powell versus Alabama. Ozzie Powell was one of the Scottsboro Nine that were arrested. But in this case, the convictions that were actually going to lead to the death penalty were overturned, saying that adequate legal counsel was not provided. When the boys were given counsel in their first trial, which is what this surrounded, they were given a real estate lawyer 3 days before the trial began. So that was not adequate for them to have a fair trial. And so here we see a picture of the 9 boys while they're in jail. The one who is shaded, that is Ozzie Powell, who was really focused on in the case. We also have the Scottsboro, Alabama location, and then the courthouse in Scottsboro. The next case with the Scottsboro boys that dealt with racial bias was Clarence Norris versus Alabama. This was in 1935, and during the second trial, it was ruled that Alabama made sure to exclude blacks from the juries, even though that was law at the time, that they had to be included. It was rarely enforced, especially kind of in this small town. And so they actually forged the jury documents, adding the names later of African American possible jurors. And so in this next picture, Clarence Norris is highlighted, and we again have the courthouse in Scottsboro. So there were several cases, Supreme Court cases after the Scottsboro trials that dealt with racial bias and showed the need for change. So the first of these is Chambers versus Florida, and this was a 1940 case that dealt with police pressuring resulting in a criminal defendant's confession. This was actually 4 African American men who were accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. And so they were questioned for a week and denied it. But they eventually confessed. But this was determined to be violating their due process. So Thurgood Marshall, who's pictured here, was actually their defense attorney for this case. And we have a picture of Florida. And then a more recent case that involved racial bias was Pena Rodriguez versus Colorado in 2017. Usually it's Colorado versus Pena Rodriguez, the state versus the defendant. However, the defendant actually sued the state, claiming racial bias among the jurors. According to jurors, another juror made this statement that I think he did it because he's Mexican and Mexican men take whatever they want. So there's clearly racial bias there. And so this is a photo of Miguel Pena Rodriguez after his trial and a picture of Colorado. Our last court case that dealt with racial bias was Miranda versus Arizona. This is the third of the cases that might be able to, the fifth of the cases that might be able to help the boys. In 1966, this ruled that any interrogation made in police custody can only be used in trial if the defendant was told of their right to counsel before and during questioning. And this did not happen for Ernesto Miranda, who's pictured here in his mugshot. And then here we have also the Miranda rights that must be read to every person before they are arrested. Okay, so some defense strategies using the cases. If we were defense attorneys and the boys were being put on trial in today's courts and they'd been arrested, these are some of the strategies we'd use to help them build a defense. We would claim that they did not receive due process. The boys were subject to abusive and extreme questioning with no option for counsel or even informed that they had a right to counsel. And so hopefully this would help them. Additionally, the boys did not have the option for counsel present during questioning. We bring this to the court's attention, and that would negate anything they had said during the questioning. And lastly, racial bias among jurors would have to be monitored. We'd specifically and carefully assess the selection of jurors. If there was any detected in the screening process, we would make sure that they would be removed, or if it was found after the trial started, we would have it have juries reselected. And then lastly, this is a video about the Scottsboro Boys by Voices of the Civil Rights Movement, and it just kind of discusses how their cases really changed the civil rights endeavors for their time and helped pave the way for equal rights.